Hello and welcome back to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. We just finished two segments with Greg Prince talking about his early years as a Mormon in the church. We talked about his time as a dental student, working in pathology, all the way culminating in his developing a cure with others for RSV, a fatal illness, respiratory illness for babies, infants. In part two, we talked about Greg and Jalynn's autistic son, Mattson, and what that was like for them and what they're trying to do to help parents with autistic children and autistic children. And then we talked about sort of his early years as a intellectual adult Mormon, trying to understand the church better, some friendships he had with Lester Bush and others that led to him writing a couple books on Mormon history, including one on the priesthood and then one on David O. McKay. What we decided to do, because we only have an hour and 6 minutes left, is we're going to push pause on our desire to talk about his book on Leonard Arrington, and we're going to jump right to current events in the church, and then we're going to come back and give his book on Leonard Arrington, hopefully another good hour or two at least, because it deserves that. So we're going to skip Leonard Arrington for now and come back to him. So, Greg, what role? I know that you're a modest guy, and you're going to be uncomfortable with this question, but you're obviously trying to play a role in the development of the LDS Church and have an impact on its people. Like you said, with the two great lessons you learned in life. What was it? Do something meaningful and make it interesting? Were those the two things? You're clearly driven by making a difference, and with your books and with your involvement in dialogue and kind of behind the scenes, what do you see your role in Mormonism as a player?
Citizen soldier.
What does that mean?
That's the title of a book by Stephen Ambrose that is an amazing account of the post-Normandy invasion. It's a companion to his book, D-Day. And he highlights in it that the real strength of the American Army was not so much the officer corps as it was the soldiers in the trenches who walked away from whatever their current occupation happened to be as private citizens and became soldiers. And that turned out to be a decisive factor in the war. That they didn't set out to be career soldiers, but when the call came, they brought whatever tools they had, and those tools were good enough. So that's one metaphor for it.
What are you trying to do?
Trying to take whatever gifts I might have and fashion them into something that I can, to use another metaphor, put on the altar. Lay the gift on the altar, and then it's up to them as to what they want to do with it. It's not my call.
And to dig one level deeper, you're choosing history. What are you trying to do with your history?
The only one that I chose was priesthood, and that really chose me because I didn't ask to be an elders quorum president, and it all started out from that. I had no ambitions to write anything. My two least favorite subjects in school were English and history. I didn't like either one of them at all. Maybe God's having a chuckle over that now, I don't know. But that's where the road took me. The priesthood book came out of being an elders quorum president. The McKay book came out of the priesthood book. Through a whole series of, again, these improbable happenings, I became acquainted with the new mission president back in D.C. Had he not had 8 kids, I never would have met him because they would have lived in the mission home that was in a different part of the state. But they had a family larger than that, could accommodate, and so the church bought a new mission home that was in our ward. I was writing the chapters of the priesthood book. We struck up a friendship. I saw that he was a different kind of mission president, that he was very open to things. I gave a lesson in High Priest on the priesthood revelation and talked about Lester Bush. That was my first encounter with Bob Wright. I remember him walking up the aisle afterwards with his black and white badge gleaming, thinking he's going to lay into me for bringing up controversial issues in priesthood meeting. And what he said was, that was fascinating. Is there any way I could meet Lester Bush? That's where that relationship started. And I gave him a couple chapters of the priesthood book. He read them. And the next time he and his wife came over for dinner, he asked me if I knew the name Claire Middlemiss. And he said she was my aunt. She was President McKay's private secretary for 35 years. She never married. Bob was her favorite nephew. She willed her papers to him because she'd never had the chance to write the biography that she had spent 35 years preparing for. Her health deteriorated. So his question to me was, I've got 2 pallets of Claire's papers in my brother's basement. Will you help me write a biography? So that took care of that one. And when I finished that, Jolene said, so what's next? And I said, I don't know, but it'll find me. And it only took a few months. I was lecturing in Logan. I don't know if you were in the tabernacle there, on the McKay book. And afterwards, a woman walked up and introduced herself to me. She says, I'm Susan Arrington Mattson. Would you be available for breakfast tomorrow? And we spent 3 hours at breakfast. And the bottom line was, my brothers and I enjoyed what you wrote about President McKay. Would you do Dad's biography? So all 3 of the books I did not go looking for. I really didn't.
But are there motives around trying to make the church be more honest about its history, trying to keep people from leaving the church? Any of those types of motives underlying your work?
The second one of those statements is much more compelling to me, as it has been for you for many years. Try to help people negotiate that faith journey. Ideally, if they can stay in, then you work towards that, but it don't always work that way. And what you're doing now in giving them a safe landing space, I think, is of equal importance. My personal concern is to do the scholarship in the best way that I can, and then trust that truth will prevail. That was the masthead of the Times and Seasons, the church's newspaper in Nauvoo. Times and Seasons, quote, truth will prevail. And I subscribe to that. Whatever else goes on, and this was President McKay's favorite hymn. Claire wrote that in the diaries. Oh, say what is truth.
'Tis the fairest gem that the riches of men can produce.
Yep. And so I'm not writing with the agenda of, boy, I'm going to show these guys something. I'm just taking, again, going back to Dave Porter, I'm taking an important topic, and I try not to spend time on unimportant topics, and giving it my very best shot. I have been assisted enormously with the 2 biographies from sources that I couldn't have predicted. The diaries were dumped into my laps in both cases.
Right.
And what do you do with that? How can you script that in the first place?
Your life
so
is,
my response is to tell the truth and to try to tell it in a way that will engage the reader. That turns out to be an art, and I think I'm getting a little better, but it certainly wasn't born with that. I was writing scientific papers.
Right.
Scientific papers don't have wide readership, especially among non-scientists. So I had to learn to write differently.
So in the spirit of telling the truth, and I made sure you were okay with this before we started, I think there's a lot of listeners who are curious to know your beliefs. So I think you've made it pretty clear you believe in God.
Yes. Let's go back to interview number 2 of this threesome. Separate faith and belief, because you just confused the 2 of them again.
Tell us the difference.
The difference, faith is not adherence to a script of statements. It's acknowledgement of a higher power to which you can relate, and in essence, a willingness to surrender your life to that higher power, to whatever extent that means. Now, clearly, we all spend most of our lives directing those lives in great detail. But it's that openness to being willing to take that turn in the road when you come upon it, even though you wouldn't have done it on your own volition, and even though it doesn't look really appealing. And even though you realize, as I did with both the biographies, I'm signing over 10 years of hard work on these, and I will get nothing out of it monetarily.
You're not getting rich off your books.
I'm not getting anything because I declined royalties for them. So, yeah, I think that's what part of faith is all about. And if it so be, then I can say that I am making a good faith effort at having faith. In terms of individual statements of belief in the church, bring out your smorgasbord and we can pick through it. I don't think that there are many of those statements that in my life make much of a difference once you have that fundamental statement of faith in place. And that's why I think I haven't had a real faith crisis, because Lester flippantly at one point early in our friendship said that he used to have a firm testimony of Hugh Nibley. And he was saying it somewhat in jest, but there's a lot of truth to that a lot of people put their faith in places that it has no business going. And that's when they get into trouble.
So for you, faith in a higher power, whatever that means, that's sort of this idea that there's some power influence that's guiding us if we're willing to pay attention.
Yeah.
And good things happen when you follow it.
No.
Hopefully.
No.
Or
That's not part of the equation.
no?
No. Go back and look at the part of the book of Job that none of our people look at.
Bad things happen when you follow too.
They'll look at the bad things happen to Job, a perfect man. Okay? But there's also the later part where it says, hey, why do the wicked go to their graves smiling? We never talk about that one. And then finally, Job shakes his fist at God and says, I demand to talk face to face. And the voice from the whirlwind basically says, fine, when you get a face, we'll talk. That's the message of Job. So if you think that the gospel is formulaic and that if you do A, you're going to get B, you're in for some tough sledding. Nobody has said, to my acknowledgement at least, that this is going to have a good short or long-term outcome. The ultra-long outcome is what you pin your faith upon. But I've seen way too many examples of people who follow the rules and they get slammed. If your motivation for following the rules is to have the happy short-term outcome, it may work, but if it doesn't, it's going to be devastating to you.
But still, in your mind, it's better to have faith than not.
I think that we can learn a lot from two groups of people. One are the atheists, and the other are the Jews, because they have something in common, and that is either a lack of belief or outright denial of a post-mortal existence. And yet, these are people who, when they're dialed in, are spectacularly moral. They do the right thing through life. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. Not because I'm going to be rewarded for it. We got to get off that wagon. We are so much into this rewards carousel in the church, it drives me crazy. And it's not part of the reality. Yeah, we'll point at the ones and say, well, he did this and got that. And you can scrounge up as many of those as you want. But those are more notable for being the exceptions if you really cast a broad net and talk to people and say, okay, how'd this work out for you? Well, as a matter of fact,
right.
I did the right thing and the world caved in on me.
So what's the point of having faith?
The point of having faith is to try to slog through that and to say what Job said that we also misquote. We talk about it as proof of the preexistence. You look at the modern translations and the best scholars of Job, and they say it has nothing to do with that. Where Job says, even though worms destroy my flesh, yet will I see God. Actually, we use that as proof of post-mortal life. Okay? It isn't. What he's saying, and if you look at the best commentators on it, he is saying, look, even though all of these things have happened to me, worms have destroyed my flesh. They've taken my children from me. They've taken everything that I own. I will not cease to see the face of God.
Which is what?
That's what faith is. It means that no matter what happens, somehow you can reach through all of that darkness and see that there. Now, what's the outcome of that? That's where we'll find out. But a lot of people have that as their guiding star, including me, and so far it's working. But it's not formulaic. And the people who want to reduce it to a formula, I think, are at great risk of getting into a real crisis.
So what does a person who have faith get that a person who doesn't have faith doesn't get?
I think it's the internal peace and somehow that communion with the infinite that transcends whatever mortality brings to us. It's that transcendent state.
So it's an internal sensation.
I don't know how to describe it, and I don't know how much of it I have experienced myself, but that's what I'm hanging it on.
Okay. So
that gets back to your question about why do I do this stuff? It's not that I'm trying to push the needle of the church in a particular direction. I'm just trying to be that citizen soldier who says, okay, I've got some intellectual tools, I've got some resources, I've got some opportunities, many of which have been put on my plate and I didn't go looking for them. What do I do with them? Can I do something that goes beyond me that may make a difference in the world? And I can do that without hanging my head in shame. If somebody gets ruffled at it, then I will say, I'm sorry that it happened, but I don't apologize.
So what? So let's just take the resurrection of Jesus for a second.
Mm-hmm.
Is it important to you whether or not he literally resurrected after 3 days? And
whether there was a bodily resurrection,
Yeah.
the empty tomb?
Yeah.
It used to mean a lot more than it does now. The idea of physicality isn't important to me the way it used to be.
So if somebody says, do you believe that Jesus resurrected? What do you say?
Yes. But what did that mean? Does that mean an actual reunification of whatever this thing is called, spirit, with the molecules of substance? It may, but that's not entirely clear from the biblical record either.
But I'm talking about does that matter to you?
What matters to me is that there is another phase in our existence that follows death, that is meaningful, that is personality driven. Now beyond that, I don't know the details and I don't see that there's much need to fret about it.
So you're saying you believe, or you have faith, I'm not sure what you'd say, that somehow some sort of essence of Greg Prince will exist after you die.
Yeah, and I would put that in the category of faith rather than belief, because I can't fill in a form that says, okay, here's what I believe about the afterlife. I used to think, well, in the Mormon culture, you know that certitude peaks at about 20 years of age. And then it gradually deteriorates from there.
For some, not for everyone.
Yeah. I have not found a person yet who could answer one simple question about afterlife. And if they could, then we'll have a greater discussion of this. Whose family or whose home do you go to for Thanksgiving? And you realize when you think about that trivial question, we don't know a thing about it, about the logistics of it. Not a thing. Talk about families being connected in an unending chain. What does that mean? How does that function? Whose home do you go to for Sunday dinner, and how many roasts do you have to cook? I don't have a clue. But there are people who have made it a point of their lives to figure that out. One of the things that I thought was right on the mark when I was dealing with Paul Dunn, he said, after I became a general authority, I asked for an audience with President McKay. And he said, I spent about an hour and a half with him and said, I've been an institute teacher for 13 years. And he said, these college kids are smart, and they ask tough questions, and I don't have all the answers, so I thought I'd come to the source. And President McKay said, well, ask your questions. He said, about half of the questions that I asked him, his response was, I don't know. Lord hasn't revealed it. And then he said, so here the prophet didn't know the answers to these questions, but all my Sunday school teachers did.
So if I ask the question slightly different, did a mortal human named Jesus die and 3 days later come out of the tomb and go to heaven? In terms of your belief, what do you say about that?
In terms of my belief, I buy into that. The details, I don't know.
So you do believe that?
Yeah.
You do believe in a literal resurrection?
Well, when you say a literal resurrection, that can go two directions. One is that there is a personality-driven existence beyond that. The other is, does that mean it recombines with a physical body? But you even have to qualify that. You say, well, if it's physical, it's going to wear down. So there's a lot we don't understand about that.
But for you, there is a Jesus who exists somewhere in the universe that is his own being, and he's governing the world somehow.
Well, however that means.
Yeah, whatever that means.
And I understand that a lot less than I used to.
So when we talk about Joseph Smith seeing God in Jesus as the first vision, 1838, suggests, what does that mean to you? And do you believe it or not, or how do you look at that?
Well, I actually published an article on that one.
So give us the short version.
Short version is...
I read the article, by the way.
That you can't verify what the details were of his visionary experience, and you can't even verify that there was one. How do you verify using objective criteria what is, at best, a non-objective experience? So the best that you can do as a scholar is to say, what does the historical record say about what he said? And how did that change over time if it did?
But I'm not asking you as a scholar, I'm asking you as a human.
But what that shows is that from a very early point, 1830, he is being quoted in newspapers as saying that he has conversed with angels. So it's not something that he suddenly made up in 1838 or even 1831. The story is there. It is also a story that's consistent with what was going on at his time and place. That there are many first vision accounts coming out of the burned over district. People who had visions that are materially almost identical with his. And I quote one in there from Levi Hathaway, which was published in 1820. Well, if you read through it carefully and you say, this has got all of the elements that Joseph Smith's first vision had. So it's not like he was coming up with something that nobody else had thought of. Were they all fraudulent? It's hard to lay that on these people. They had what they felt were authentic visionary experiences, and they tried to reduce those to words. Joseph did too. The added dimension of his was that it morphed from whatever the historical antecedent was into a theological narrative that went in lockstep with his developing theology of deity. So as that theology evolved, then whenever he retold the first vision, he locked it in at this level, not at this level. So if you do the parallel columns and read across, it's always consistent within a given frame of time.
So whether or not he had ill intent, for many, that just means he's making it up and adding to it and embellishing.
Well, if that's the best they can do with it, I can't change that for them.
What do you do with it?
What I do with it is say, yeah, how would you expect it to be otherwise?
Right.
How do you put onto paper an out-of-body experience that's totally non-relatable to anything you have ever experienced before? Then couple that with founding a faith tradition that is evolving in its own trajectory and bringing those two together repeatedly over time. That's the story of the first vision. So yes, it is changing, and you've got two personages in where you had one earlier. Those aren't the most fundamental changes. The biggest whopper is, okay, the first account says, I already concluded from my study of the Bible that all the churches were wrong. 1838 says, well, I read the Bible, and it was obvious you couldn't conclude. They're diametrically opposed. You can't harmonize those, but some of our friends try that. And so what drove him to the grove in the first instance was not that. He figured that one out. He said, I was sinful. This goes right down the center of where all of these other first vision accounts were in that same time and place. What drove them to pray? I was a sinner. I wanted forgiveness of my sins. What's the message of the first vision to him? Your sins are forgiven. But then it became an institutional narrative. It became the creation narrative of the church. And so it changed materially. Now, I can't figure out which church is right. I'll go ask God. And since God told me that they're all wrong, friends, that proves to you that we are the right one. It wasn't there before.
So where are your beliefs in regard to that narrative?
My belief is that he had some authentic experience that channeled...
That was divine?
Yes.
Whatever God is and whatever Jesus is, they did manifest themselves to Joseph.
Or, I don't know the details of that.
Or, what do you mean, or?
Well, because if the earliest account only talks about one person, it just says the Lord.
So what do you hang your belief on?
And do you recall the George Burns movie from, 35 years ago, Oh God? Mm-hmm. Where John Denver says, well, how can you prove to me you're God? George Burns takes his card out and gives it to him and says, God. You know? Is a kid going to say, so are you really who you say you are? You think some of these things through, and it becomes silly to make some of the leaps that we make of it. I don't know the answer to that. I'm trying to think of how a 14-year-old or 15-year-old or whatever he was kid digests any of this stuff and tries to make sense of it. But as he comes back to it, he's making more sense of it as a theological statement.
But I'm not asking you what happened. I'm asking you what you believe happened.
Well, I believe there was an encounter between him and deity.
Okay.
Period.
Okay.
Details, stay tuned. I don't know.
Okay. So
I know what the historical record says,
right,
but I don't know.
So whether or not God, what he claimed eventually was that God said all the churches are corrupt and evil, and whatever.
That's the theological narrative at that point, and it's totally contradicted by the earlier accounts.
So is that part of your belief, that God told him that all the other churches were an abomination?
No, but you see that
he was to start the
that becomes a statement in a catechism rather than faith. And I'll look at that and say, no, it's clear from 1831 that wasn't the message. But it's clear why he would put it in there, and that is, this is the creation narrative of his church.
So,
and what better way to legitimize it than to have God say, all of the others are wrong?
So Joseph had a divine experience, but you're not placing your beliefs that he was called to start the one true church.
Well, in fact, if you look at any of the first vision narratives, that's not there.
But that's what
not
we
any
teach.
of them.
That's what we all teach, and that's what we all.
No, I understand that. I understand that. Where did that mandate come from? It's later.
Okay, and I'm just talking about you.
So. Well, I understand that, but there is no element in any of the first vision accounts that tells Joseph go form a church.
Right. Okay, so that's not part of your belief.
No.
Okay.
That's a later mandate
that you don't buy.
No, I do, but it's not coming out of the first vision. It's part of the Book of Mormon saga.
Okay. So you're not...
And even that's evolutionary, because when he gets into the Book of Mormon, he's not obsessed with starting a church. It's at the tail end that then they get concerned about, okay, religious authority, da-da-da-da. There's the implied authority there. Then they're looking for explicit rather than implicit authority.
So for you, the idea that the LDS Church is the one true church, that's not part of your beliefs?
I have interacted with enough other churches at a fairly sophisticated level. I'm the only Mormon who has ever sat on a steering committee at Wesley Seminary, and I still sit there, that I'm not about to point fingers at them and say there's not truth there. Now, who's got the most truth? I don't know. It becomes a question of show me the walk. And I find that I am usually greatly envious of other traditions because they're doing a much better job than I'm doing and that I see a lot of my co-religionists doing. So I'm not going to say anything like that. If anything, I'm saying help us to catch up with you.
Did an angel deliver literal golden plates to Joseph Smith that were an ancient record of Native Americans that then Joseph translated into the Book of Mormon?
I don't know.
What do you think, based on your review of the evidence?
My review of the evidence jumps forward 6 years and then backtracks. I think the key to understanding the Book of Mormon is the Book of Abraham. And I'm surprised that people haven't gone that direction, because to me, it's obvious what's going on there. Look at the Book of Abraham. You have an ancient artifact, papyrus. You have a prophet, scribe, call him whatever you want, and you have a new text. And it's the interaction of the first two that produces the third. Okay? We don't have to guess about the papyrus. And it's baloney to say, well, we're missing that part of the papyrus. No, we're not, because Joseph's Egyptian alphabet and grammar makes it very clear. He's got the hieroglyphs in there, and he's got his translation off to the side. And that's part of the papyrus fragment that we still have.
Right.
So forget that one. Nice try, guys,
So he
but it doesn't
didn't
work.
translate the papyri.
Well, he translated...
In a word of translation that anyone would
That's right.
would mean.
That's right.
Which is the word we've been using and teaching forever.
Yes. And so the Book of Abraham, in my view, is best described as midrash. Midrash is the Hebrew
It's
term.
channeling something from God.
No, it isn't. It's the interplay between the scribe and the sacred text that leads to a new text. That's midrash. This. The Talmud, that's what it is. The Babylonian and the Jerusalem Talmud.
But that's not what he told us it was.
Understood. But you see, part of the essential function of a mystic is that he or she operates on a level not necessarily understanding himself or herself what's going on.
But
So it's part active, part passive, what's happening there. But if you look at the Book of Abraham as the midrash that devolves from the papyrus, that doesn't have to have any material linkage to the content of the papyrus, there's the key to the Book of Mormon. For a year, our study group in Maryland was taught once a month by a professor of Hebrew Bible from Wesley Seminary. She is Christian, she's of the United Church of Christ. But her big deal is Hebrew Bible. And she read the Book of Mormon in preparation for teaching us. And she said one day, without any disparaging content to it, because she respects the Book of Mormon as an authentic American scripture, she said, the Book of Mormon is Joseph Smith's book-length midrash on the Bible.
Right. But really, I imagine that you would worry that you would get in trouble for just really owning and admitting this. But what I hear you saying is you probably don't think that an angel delivered gold plates to Joseph.
That part is inaccessible to me, so it doesn't matter what I believe about that. There is enough of a witness that there was some kind of artifact there. Because several of the people who wrote about it say, well, the plates were covered with, but I could feel through them. There's some kind of artifact in the room. He's not looking at it. None of the accounts of the translation process have him gazing at the plates. They got him with his face in the hat and a stone in the bottom of it. But nonetheless, there's still the linkage between an ancient artifact that he considers to be a source of canon and the process of him interacting with that, even though it's through the hat and the stone, produces the text.
But he's telling us that he got gold plates from an angel that were an ancient record of Native Americans. We know that those that what he produced in the Book of Mormon makes no scientific sense.
Yep. And he may
Which means that he likely didn't have golden plates from an angel that were an ancient record.
Well, you're connecting two dots that don't necessarily need to be connected that way.
Explain to me why.
Forget about the angel carrying gold plates to him for now, because that's inaccessible to us.
Yeah,
we have no idea.
No, you do have an idea because you're a scientist and you know that.
No, that's exactly why I don't have an idea, John, because I deal with data, and that's not a data point. We've got accounts from third parties saying there were plates in the room. So there is your ancient artifact that corresponds with the Egyptian papyrus 6 years later. You've got...
Not necessarily ancient. It could be something he made that year.
Whatever. But there's an artifact, hymn, a new text. And that's the process. If you are able to work your way through that model, then you can look at the current Book of Mormon, and if you see the historical anachronisms, you say, yeah, what do you expect? Look at the process. That's what happens with that.
But you're using sophistication, philosophy, finesse, whereas a practical person is going to say, is the Book of Mormon really what it claims to be? Because if it is, I'm interested. But if it's just Joseph thinking that he's channeling something that may or may not actually be,
Yep.
He's lied to us, right?
Well,
And the story I've been told is wrong. And in a previous episode, I heard you sort of say, all these people that leave the church over these sorts of things, they miss the point. The point is the metaphor. The point is the symbolism. The point is your divine connection. And whether or not things actually happen doesn't matter. And it sounds like you're saying whether or not it happened doesn't matter.
no, I think you have to decide which question you want to answer. Do you want to answer the question, is the Book of Mormon a literal translation of an ancient record that describes the people who lived in the Americas?
Which
That's
is what the church
proposition number
claims
one.
it is, and what Joseph Smith claimed it was.
Proposition number two is the Book of Mormon Scripture?
Right. And on the first question, your answer is?
The first
you don't know.
question is that I'm not willing to say definitively that there's no historicity in it, but I am saying that the preponderance of evidence doesn't make it look good for the literalist. Because I am a scientist and I do know something about things like DNA. The problem is that people get hung up on this model, and when it caves in, they don't have anything left. What you have to realize is that scientists make their living by constructing paradigms and then moving to new paradigms when the old ones don't work. It doesn't mean that there was deceit in the old paradigm. It may mean, usually it means that it's the best we could do given the data that we had and the instrumentation that we had. But it's time to move on to a new paradigm. To me, the paradigm of the Book of Mormon that has been mostly neglected is to say, so don't focus so much on what you think it is, focus on what has it done. Now, I have talked to a lot of people, and it's scripted. If I ask them 3 questions, I know exactly what they're going to say on the first 2, and then I know the third one will be an essay question or an essay answer. First question is, so, did you read it from beginning to end? Well, no. It's kind of boring. It's hard to get through the battles or Isaiah. So what do you remember about it? Well, there are a lot of wars in it. And most people can't tell you that much more about the content, especially if it's been a while since they read it. Third question is, so what was the experience in reading it? Oh, well, let me tell you. And that's the part that gets thrown out with the bathwater. Since that book came into being, regardless of what it is or how it came into being, it has done something that probably only 2 other books have done, the Bible and the Quran. And that is that it facilitates that encounter between the finite and the infinite. It gets back to what I was talking about earlier with the mission of Joseph Smith. If you are a religious leader, you have to have the vision, but then you have to make that a vision accessible to your believers. He gave them that tangible access through the Book of Mormon. That was his very first symbol that he handed to them. They didn't know who this guy was. But the missionaries were deployed. They took this book. People read that book, and something happened that changed their lives. And it sure wasn't Second Nephi. I presume you've heard that story of the guy who carried a Book of Mormon in his vest pocket, robbed one day, gets shot, saves his life. Moral of the story, not even a bullet can make it through 2nd Nephi. But that's the part that doesn't enter the discussion. There's this ferocious fight between the literalists and the non-literalists over the Book of Mormon. They're all on this same hill of historicity. And I just want to say, time out, guys. Back off a bit and look at that book for what it does, and then answer the question, so how does it do that? Even if you look at the other books, like the Book of Napoleon or the Great Wars, that are written in the same genre, they haven't done anything. So I'll turn that question around to anybody and say, okay, you give me an explanation of how that book has done what it's done. And let's not get hung up on talking about whether it's historical or not. I don't see it as an ancient history. I just don't see that it has a leg to stand on as being that. I've heard of hybrid explanations. None of them carry any water with me. I'm content to go with what Denise Hopkins, the professor of Hebrew Bible, told me. It's a book-length midrash on the Bible. And I'm fine with that. Try to write a midrash on a sacred text and see where it goes.
And yet, you know, there have been religious and political movements that have made enormous impacts on the world, and that doesn't make them true or even good necessarily. But it sounds like you're
no,
making
wait. Whoa. Isn't goodness as goodness does? If it is impacting people and changing their lives in a particular path that points them towards good rather than bad, how can one speak disparagingly of that? Isn't that the whole point, to move people and society in an upward direction? Now, there are a lot of religions that are not religions of the book. And I don't have any nasty things to say about them because I know a lot about what they've done to move people up. Ours happens to be one of the book. But that book, in spite of being nearly 2 centuries old, hasn't lost its luster. You talk to the missionaries, or you talk to the converts, and more often than not, that was the key to them coming in. Now, sometimes it doesn't hold them in. That's a different topic for a different time.
So I get that point. I think it's reasonable. I think I had an interview once where Dr. Dave Christian talked about the sort of validity versus utility, and you're basically saying the utility is what matters. The fruits are, you know, the importance is in the fruits of what the book has produced, and whether or not the book is actually what it claims to be is a lot less important to you.
By their fruits you shall know them. I've heard that before.
Yeah. Okay. So when somebody, I think that's a totally reasonable perspective, and even an interesting and an honorable one. But it sounds like you're speaking disparagingly to the person who just basically says, number one, it's important to me that Joseph told the truth and that the book be what it claims to be. And if Joseph was making it up or envisioning some mystical thing, but there really weren't gold plates and there really wasn't an angel, I'm not interested in following this thing.
Okay,
and I can go and be a Buddhist or meditate or join a secular community and live a noble and good life and even advance humanity.
What aggrieves me, and if I have spoken incorrectly, I will correct it now, is not intending to speak disparagingly of that person, but of what has happened. I think that's tragic. I think it's avoidable. And I think to the extent that that person had control over the outcome, then it is very unfortunate and partly that person's fault. I think that we have a church full of lazy people. And I will stand by that. Because I have seen how shallow their understanding is of things that they could easily understand if they exhibited that much initiative. But they won't read. If it's not on Facebook, a lot of people won't pay any attention to it. This gets back to what Helen Whitney told me when she was talking about the documentary. You people have a great religion, but you got to own it. And I don't see very many Mormons who really own their religion. I don't think they know what it's about.
But I think what's built into your position is that leaving and following a secular life is inferior to staying and following a religious life.
I don't say that across the board. I think if people find more answers and more direction outside than inside, then I can understand that they would leave. I regret that, because I think that even if they are finding satisfaction there is a dimension to the religious life, and I don't mean the church life, to the spiritual life, that requires community. And when they leave, where is that community? They can still be pious, but I think that there is a dimension to their spiritual life that is going to be missing if they don't have a faith community in which they can act part of that out. And that's why I really mourn the loss of these people, because they and the institution would have been better off if they had stayed and built it. But they, by leaving it, are leaving something behind as well. And I don't see that many of them re-engage in a new, vibrant faith community. Now, maybe that's what you'll provide them with what you're doing. I don't know.
Not me.
But religion can't be lived fully in isolation. It has to have the engagement of fellow believers.
But what about someone who doesn't want to live a religion? What if it's someone who just wants to live a good life, serve others?
I'm not passing judgment on that person.
But it sounds like you're saying somehow, more often than not, you see that somebody who wants to follow a secular life, to build community in secular ways, to find ways to meditate or pursue secular spirituality that isn't connected to a religion or even a faith or a belief system.
No, not at all. I'm talking specifically about the people who have been in the LDS Church, who have chosen to bail out. That's it. Earlier on, I talked about atheists, I talked about Jews, whom I admire greatly, in part because of their ability to follow a strong moral compass with the absolute conviction in their hearts that there's nothing beyond death. They're doing it because it's the right thing to do. That's all the motivation they need. So people who are outside of Mormonism, who have found meaningful lives and are happy and are helping to build society, I have no criticism of that.
But then you use the word tragedy. So what's the tragedy?
I talk about tragedy for those who have bailed out of Mormonism, because I have seen what a community that can be when it functions well. And I mourn that that is no longer accessible to them. It doesn't point the finger solely at them. The community has plenty of blame to go around as well, because we need to make it a more vibrant, attractive community than we do.
So you're saying the community would be better if they had stayed in a healthy way?
I think they and the community would have been better had they stayed, sure.
But then you're saying that them leaving, they go to something inferior. Because when you say better...
No, what I'm saying is that by dissociating themselves from a community of faith, that I don't see that they have the complete spiritual life that they otherwise would have had.
So it is inferior. All right.
Incomplete.
Okay.
Incomplete. Because
That
the part of it that they have may be superior to what I've still got, but it's only part of the package. Are we going to say this is better than that? I'm saying this is different. It's missing something, and if it had that, I think it would make the whole package better.
I think you mean that in a really respectful way. I think you also might imagine that that could be experienced as kind of offensive to somebody who would say, "Don't tell me that I'm going to resign myself to an inferior existence and that I would have been better off."
No, and I'm not saying it's inferior for them. What I am saying, and I'll hold by it, is I mourn our loss in their leaving.
Okay.
If they take offense in that statement, I'm sorry, because no offense was intended, and I don't think that there's any offense that is connected to that kind of a statement.
But I think you really are saying that maybe for most people, if the church had found a way to be better and they had stuck with it, maybe for most people they would have been better off than leaving.
That's my hope.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, yeah. It's kind of your...
But it has so many elements to it that I can't be
every
pointing
individual. So
I think all of us, I think the institution should always be going through a process of self-evaluation and saying, are we doing this the best that we could? Are we really putting those souls first? Is the Sabbath made for man or man for the Sabbath? Those kinds of questions, I think, need to be brought up continually as correctives, individually and institutionally.
Sure. Tell me real quick what time you have to leave.
It is 5:45. I'd better leave in about, let's say, I think if I leave by 6:15, we're okay.
Beautiful.
Another half hour.
Okay. So you, of all people, and what I love about you is that you don't try and put rose-colored glasses on how you see the church. So I don't have to tell you the harm that the church can cause, but I will for just a second. So there's the racism, both for Native Americans and for blacks, people of color. There's systematic, both in practice and in teaching. There's the sexism where women, for the perception of many, are subjugated to a second class. There's the way LGBT people are treated, the suicides that you're very aware of and writing a book about, I think, last time I talked to you anyway. And there's all sorts of ways where power and influence is wielded in ways that wreak havoc in the lives of the members, from covering up abusers and predators to shaming people about very common behaviors. There is a lot of pain that the church can inflict on people. And so the more, and this is not going to be news to my listeners, but the more that I've been involved in the mental health profession and seeing the depression and the anxiety and the divorce and the sadness that can come from religious affiliation, then I say, how do I maintain my membership in an organization? How do I give them my money? How do I give them my time? How do I give them my reputation, my name, when that is fueling this damage? Agreeing that there's so much good and beauty. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to say it's all bad, but the bad can be so egregious that I say, to stay in, aren't you being complicit in supporting that harm? What do you say to that?
Now, are you asking me individually? Am I being complicit?
I'm not. I'm asking, how do you?
Or are you asking it rhetorically?
Both. Do it rhetorically and then personally.
Personally, no, because I not only stay in because it works for me and it works for people who are dear to me, including family members, but I stay in because I see how much can be done and is being done, in spite of the fact that a lot of things aren't being done the way they should be. Now, that equation to me gives an answer of stay. Other people with the same equation would probably say go. That's their choice. I mourn it when that happens. Because usually I don't see that there is a better alternative out there, or at least a better alternative to what the ideal can be. The reality may not be as good here as it is on the other side of the fence. I don't know. Rhetorically, no, I don't buy that people of goodwill staying in an institution that is trying to serve its people are being complicit in something evil. No. I won't even take a first step in that direction. If you look at the complexity of the world today, if you look at the complexity of a bureaucracy trying to run a 15 million member church or whatever number you want to plug in there, and it's all being run by mortals who don't have real good toolkits, none of us, then sometimes it's surprising that it does as well as it does. It doesn't surprise me when it malfunctions. And having read 60,000 pages of diaries, I can footnote that to great detail of where it has crunched people. Yeah, and I regret that happened. And I think usually that would have been preventable, but it didn't get prevented. And so, yeah, there is a lot of harm that's done. I don't think most of it gets done in a spirit of malice, but to the person who's harmed, it doesn't much matter what the intent was. If you've suddenly been crunched, you're crunched. If you're dead, it doesn't matter what the cause was either. And we've had way too many people check out. And I think that's an enormous tragedy and preventable. How do you get from here to a better state, though? There was a general conference talk about a year after the priesthood revelation. And everybody seems to have forgotten about it, but it's worth going back and revisiting it. Spencer Kimball got up and he said that the church has reached a certain plateau. And he said some changes have been made administratively, like a certain revelation. But he said, in order for us to get to the next level, it will be dependent upon the church members to act individually. That struck me, and I'm surprised that it hasn't been repeated since then. But I believe very much that the collective health of the church rests on the individual health of its members and their willingness to be good citizen soldiers. I don't see enough of that going on. I see too many people who just show up and sit there. If they were thoughtful about it, if they were thinking, okay, how do I magnify my little c calling, whatever that is, then I think we'd be in a much better position. That circles back to why do I write books? Because it's something that I found that I can do that can make at least a small difference, and that difference seems to go in a good direction.
So the young gay kid that kills himself, the man whose wife leaves him and takes the kids because he lost his faith, the woman who doesn't achieve maybe her potential because she was taught a certain thing. It sounds like you're saying the good outweighs the bad, and so those are kind of acceptable.
No, those are not acceptable. Not one of those is acceptable. I think every one of those things is a tragedy. Every one of them is preventable and should be prevented, and the fact that they aren't being prevented is a shame on us. And how do we fix that so that that doesn't keep happening?
But in terms of your membership and affiliation, it's not enough to shake that.
And so far, 68.
Because of the good in it for you and for the good it does to others.
It's not just putting things in the balance and say, where does that needle on the scale reside? No, it comes from that deeper level of this thing that we call faith. I'll be talking tomorrow night because I'm supposed to hand out the 3 awards at the dialogue banquet. But one of the recipients is Darius Gray. I brought Darius back to Maryland several years ago and said, we're going to get your story on the record. So I flew him back and we spent 12 hours recording his history. And I was amazed at the number of off-ramps on his highway that he could and maybe should have taken along the way. But he didn't. Any rational assessment of it would say, you're crazy for having stuck with this thing.
And this is a black man who joined the church before the revelation.
But he didn't join up because it had a system of beliefs that he thought was palatable. It was something deeper than that, and that has held him ever since then against odds that I don't know I would be able to overcome. I don't have that level of empathy to be able to say, okay, I get it. This is what a black man in this church in 1964 would have been experiencing. It's inaccessible to me. What is accessible to me is a profound sense of awe that something deep inside him has allowed him to stay in when all of the traffic signals said leave. And on a good day, maybe I'm a little bit of what he is on that, but I can't even carry his coat for what he's been through. So yeah, I will stay in and continue to do what I do in good faith, meaning that I give it the best shot that I have, and then I put it on the altar, and then I go and do something else. I'm not concerned about trying to force an agenda with anybody, But I think, and largely because of what I saw in my role models with Juanita, with Mountain Meadows, and with Lester, with Blacks, that really good scholarship over time is going to prevail. It will be informative, and it can inform at a high level.
How do you assess the status, the health of the church today? Healthy and thriving, flat, or declining?
I think we got some real problems, and the one that concerns me the most is the youth. We're hemorrhaging badly. I can't put numbers on it, but it's part of a larger process. I co-sponsored a seminar at Wesley Seminary 2 years ago, and we brought in about 36 people, including David Beck, who was then the general president of the Young Men. And it was a cross-section of religious traditions that was focused on this issue of youth. And the two things that came out of it were, everybody's got the problem and nobody has the solution. So it's not just a Mormon thing, but we're not immune from it, and I don't see that we have done anything yet to address it.
Do you have a sense for why that's happening?
Inertia is a very strong force in this church. To try to get a full change in direction is very, very difficult. When I started working on the Priesthood book, I was
No, why youth are leaving?
Why youth are leaving?
Yeah.
A simplistic statement that I think can apply to all ages now about religion in general is, if it works, I stay. If it doesn't work, I leave. It's not working for them. That's why they leave.
And
but it has to work on a level that's different than what we thought it was. They are not in there out of a sense of duty. They are not in there over truth claims. It's a very practical decision for them. If it's working for me, if it's helping me to negotiate a tough, dangerous world, then I'm in. If it's not, I got thousands of other alternatives.
Are you concerned about 30-somethings, 40-somethings? Do you think that
I think
adults leaving the church is a problem, or not
I think it is. I think it is, but I think it's less of a problem than the youth, because that's your future foundation.
So is the church overall hemorrhaging, or is it just sort of acceptable attrition that's been going on forever?
I can't put numbers on it. My sense, just from doing a lot of listening and a little bit of talking, is this is a crisis. I think that's why what we did with Hans Mattson struck such a deep nerve. It wasn't Hans Mattson. Hans was the public face of a deep crisis. That's why that resonated.
But Hans had nothing to do with the youth. So those are separate things.
I understand that. It's happening at different levels for different reasons. I think the youth provide a particular cohort that responds because that's the way they view the world. Others are responding more, I think, over particular elements of faith claims or of historical claims that don't hold up. I don't think that that's an issue for the 20-somethings.
Right.
I don't think they get that deeply into it. I think for them it's a very pragmatic approach to it that says either it's going to help me or I'm gone.
So you've touched on this a bit, and we're going to redress this when we talk about Leonard Arrington, address this again. But, I think it's a reasonable question to ask. Leonard Arrington, Dialogue, Sunstone, your books, all the New Mormon history. Mm-hmm. The Brethren kept that away from the membership for a long time because they felt like it would damage the membership. Mm-hmm. And I think someone can make a very compelling case that, in fact, the opening up of its history is severely damaging the membership and leading to the hemorrhages.
Well, it is a problem because we created the circumstances.
It's still a problem, though.
Yes, it is. I understand that. And it's not a problem that has an easy resolution. There's going to be fallout no matter how you address it, because any response that you give to a group that questions will be a problematic response for the group that doesn't question. How do you keep those two groups segregated? You can't. They did the best they could, which was to bury the history essays deep in the LDS.org website, intentionally, so that the true blues wouldn't stumble on them by accident. But that only buys you a little bit of time. And then you're confronted with the power of the internet. People can't escape the data, and if they encounter data that are disturbing to them, they're going to get disturbed. We should have been there decades ago telling the story, but we didn't. You're right. We varnished it, we hit the ball, now we're paying the price.
But Arrington, Dialogue, Sunstone, your books, Mormon stories, they are damaging the church.
You think so?
Aren't they?
I don't think so. No.
They're causing people to leave at a rate that you just said is alarming. Is it almost?
I don't see that as damaging the church. I think what that does is to focus our attention on we've got to act quickly and decisively to try to reach these people and basically give them a mea culpa and say, look, I understand why you want to leave. Please understand that we were acting in the best of intentions, but we damaged you by not revealing the truth to you before. So let's try to make that whole.
But you wouldn't agree that all these people leaving the church is damaging the church?
Oh, I think it is damaging to the church, but I think
because of the history.
Yes.
So the history is damaging the church.
The history is not damaging the church. It's the realization that there was a betrayal of confidence that is causing. You saw it. This was the bottom line message of that survey. It wasn't a single statement here that took them out. It was the realization that one led to another, and then my church has not trusted me with the truth. That's what took them out. It wasn't a simple statement of the Book of Mormon is fill in the blank. It was the betrayal of trust. And where that betrayal has happened, yeah, it has damaged the church, and it's a self-inflicted wound. But it's a wound now that is one that we're going to have to figure out how to heal, because it's inevitable that this information will continue to be out there. The internet has changed everything permanently, period. There's no going back. And so the only way that we can get the message out in a way that helps the church is to get the full message out and in a package that makes more sense. We're playing catch up because we have been asleep at the controls, and those who would detract from the church are very sophisticated in the information they put out, in the way that they put it out on their websites, and we no longer control the data.
What's your assessment of the Gospel Topics essays?
I think that it's a reasonable compromise given what all of the factors were that they were having to deal with, meaning they had to get that through a group of 15 men, some of whom probably didn't want any of those to go out. And what went out sometimes bore little resemblance to what went in, and they're trying to deal with these two constituencies out there at the same time that can't be reconciled. So it's an impossible situation to negotiate without fallout, and we're seeing fallout. But rather than wring our hands over the fallout, I think we need to realize that that's the price we're now paying for the way that we handled things in the past. Let's get to better ground. And we'll mourn those who were lost along the way, but that's what happens.
Are you satisfied with the product of the essays?
No.
Why? What's wrong with them?
Because I think that they're only telling part of the story still. I can understand why they're holding back on other parts of it. So I will give them credit for how much they have done. And I applaud, really. If you look at some of the things that are in there, it's astounding that that would show up on a church website. So I don't want to take anything away from that. But you ask on a personal level, am I satisfied with it? No. I would prefer full disclosure. I would prefer that they do with all of these things what Rick Turley and his co-authors did with Mountain Meadows. Put it all out there. And they did,
apologize?
And nobody died.
How about apologize?
Not my call. Institutions have to deal with that, how they deal with it, and very few institutions of any kind are very comfortable dealing with apologies. That's something that they got to figure out.
How do you feel about, and this is just from a historical perspective, How do you feel about things like Mormon Stories, Mormon Think, CES Letter? Do you feel like they're good things, bad things, mixed?
I am a firm believer in the First Amendment.
I'm saying, are they good? Are they helpful? Are they moving the ball forward or not?
Well, I think that that's going to be conditioned on who the observer is. Some people read those and are helped. Other people read those and they're harmed.
But what do you think the overall benefit is? Are they
I think the
beneficial?
overall benefit is...
So start with CES Letter. Is that a good thing for the church, a bad thing for the church? A good thing for the members, a bad thing for the members?
Well, my gripe with the CES Letter is I think it's a pretty bad piece of literature.
What's bad about it?
It's just not written well. I could have done a much better job and gotten the same points across. I think more forcefully. I think it's shoddy scholarship. I don't say that he's wrong in it. I just think that as a package, that doesn't rise to this level of achievement where I think it could have.
So when a lot of people cite that as being the reason for their exit.
I know. And there's not anything in there that he was the first to point out.
Of course not.
And Grant was the same way. He just did a collation of things that are already around. There was no original scholarship in either one of those.
And they're not claiming, probably.
No, I understand that. It cycles back around to how do you deal with the full set of data that we are now being confronted with? And nobody is quite prepared yet to know exactly how to do that. Again, it's the power of the internet. The internet has democratized the data. The data are out there. It's the Wild West, and the one who is going to prevail is the one who comes forward with the most persuasive presentation of the data points, because nobody controls the data points anymore.
And is your concern only with the level of scholarship and the writing, or
No.
are you dissatisfied with the contextualization of the information?
Which information?
For CES Letter, for an insider's view of Mormon origins.
What I would prefer to see is the type of treatment that I have tried to do myself, as I did with the First Vision article, and that is put it all out there, don't hide anything, because it won't take long for your reader to figure out if you're doing that, and then give it context. Say, all right, what does this mean? What's a model, what's a paradigm that allows us to deal with this information and to do it in an honest fashion? Now, two people of total integrity can look at the same data points and come up with different conclusions and still maintain their integrity. Somebody can look at Joseph Smith's vision or the Book of Mormon and say, I see God in there. That's enough for me. Somebody else with equal intelligence, equal integrity can read the Book of Mormon and say, that's kind of boring, but okay, and feel nothing from it.
And conclude it's a fraud, or not true.
Or not even, just say, not even go that far of trying to decide if it's a fraud or not. It doesn't register. So a lot of it is in the eyes of the beholder. But I don't think that was sterling scholarship. That would be my criticism of it.
Do you think it's doing a disservice by leading too many people out? Do you see that? You said you're sad when people leave. You mourn it.
Yeah.
People are saying CES Letter, Grant Palmer, even Mormon Stories are leading people out. So you do associative or community property. You conclude that you
I think it's sad that people would leave, but I don't condemn him and say he did a disservice. I think that the freedom of the press is one of the foundational pieces of our society, and I don't begrudge those who want to write what they want to write. It's a free society. I'm asking if you think
it's a good thing, not if you think he has the right to do it.
If it's a good thing?
For the church.
Well, John, for some of the members it has been a good thing. For others it hasn't. How do I make a single judgment on that? I can't.
Okay. So it's been both?
It's been both, sure.
But overall you don't have a negative assessment in terms of its value to the church?
My only negative assessment is I just don't think it was a very solid piece of scholarship.
What did you think about Kelly and Ordained Women in terms of the same sort of question, its value to the church?
I think that remains to be seen. I don't know that needle has moved much yet. And if it does move, will it be because of Kate and her movement, or will it be because of other things? And the answer probably will be it's a combination. I don't know.
Did it set feminism back, in your view? Mormon feminism?
In my view, yes. And I told Kate that directly.
Why?
And I told her on more than one occasion, because I had lived through the 70s and 80s when I saw the same thing happen over the ERA. And that did set things back.
What's the calculus and how it set things back?
Well, there is a strong tradition in this church that if the brethren perceive something as a frontal assault, that they will dig in. And what I saw with the ERA movement back in the 70s and 80s, and we were right in the middle of it back there in Virginia. That's where Mormons for ERA was founded. That's where Sonia Johnson was. That pushed things back. There was another example in 1998 where a committee had been formed to address the residual racism in church materials. You know about that. And you probably know some of the people who were on that committee. There were some things in church published materials that were overtly racist. There were other things that a person of color would see as objectionable. A person not of color is blinded to. And so there was a process of going through this and figuring out, how do we get rid of this stuff? How do we deconstruct that scaffolding of folklore that supported a racist policy about priesthood for over a century? One of the members of that committee decided that things weren't happening fast enough. And so he went to Larry Stammer of the LA Times. And Stammer published a front page LA Times article about the existence of this committee. The committee member apparently thinking that the way to nudge the brethren into action is to go public. It set the whole thing back almost 20 years. So yeah,
Isn't that on the brethren and not on the person who talked about it?
Well,
shouldn't they be doing the right thing regardless of the consequences?
If I know that my taking a certain action is going to set the whole movement back, am I just going to sit there and blame the church for that? And this was not an act of total ignorance at all. We had lengthy discussions about this.
Is that about ordained women or the...
I'm talking about ordained women now.
Okay.
On 3 occasions, lengthy ones. And the message all 3 times is, this will cause them to go to ground, to dig in, and it'll set the whole thing back. Blew it off.
Do you feel like Mormon Stories did the same thing?
No, I don't. I think that Mormon Stories has been, on balance, a very beneficial voice out there. I think that you have given voice to sides of arguments that otherwise would have been silent. Sometimes it's been edgier than at others. Okay, I'm a grown-up, I can deal with that. Not everybody in the church views it that same way, but my gosh, they'll be critical. There are going to be some people in the church who will be critical of anything. It doesn't matter what it is. Some people will say, this is wrong. You've done wrong. You've hurt somebody. Well, at some point, you just have to figure out which voices you pay attention to. And are you going to let those few critics tell you what you're going to do with your life? My response is, I'm acting in good faith. I'm a big boy. If I need to, I'll take it up to the Lord on appeal.
What do you think about the church excommunicating people like Kate or me or Grant Palmer or others?
I think
September 6th, name your pick.
I mourn all of those, every one of them.
Do you think they should have happened?
I think that excommunication is a procedure that should be reserved for only the rarest of circumstances. And in my worldview, that would be somebody who is actively trying to tear down the whole church. There have been instances of that. One that comes to mind was John C. Bennett, who was trying to destroy the church. I think it would have been inappropriate not to excommunicate him. I don't see that in the modern era as having driven these people who have been thrown out. And I really mourn that that was the response to it, particularly in some of the cases where it eventually became apparent that this was not the result of a consensus, that it was not a local action, that it broke the rules. I think that was not the way that we should have responded. If you look in other religious traditions, excommunication is a really, really serious thing. But it's been used, I think, in our tradition much too frequently.
Are the brethren worthy of the members? You talk about the red chairs. They're making all sorts of mistakes, but they're also doing a lot of good. Are they worthy of our continued affiliation?
I don't know any of them. Well, let me restate that. I know very few of them well. The ones that I know well, I consider to be among the finest people I have ever met. And a couple of them I would put in a short list that would probably be fewer than 10 people that I have ever met. I don't know any of them enough to say, this man is bad. This man is destroying the church. I don't know any of them that well. If they're there, I'm oblivious to it. I think often, though it sounds like a trivial thing, of the sign in the saloon. It says, don't shoot the piano player, he's doing the best he can. And knowing a little bit about what they face, which I do not envy at all. And I say that on the basis of having spent now 20 years deeply embedded in data that go right to the top of the church. I have sympathy for what they're trying to do. And you saw it in the Arrington book, you saw it in the McKay book. It's not white hats versus dark hats. It's all different shades of gray there. And depending on which side of the table you are sitting on, you might be perceived by the other side as wearing a black hat. But if you sit on the opposite side, then you see the world a little differently. I recall when I was working on the McKay book, I interviewed Mike Grillicus. Mike married Lorraine Day, who was a fairly prominent actress in the 40s and 50s. And they lived in Westwood Ward the rest of their lives. But Mike said that when they built the Polynesian Cultural Center, and he was pulled in to be part of the management of that, he said the 12 was not on board. And I knew that. McKay had said to Wendell Mendenhall, just build it, after the 12 turned it down. So Mike said, I picked Harold B. Lee up at the airport. He was coming back from Australia, and he was going to speak at a conference in Laia. So we're driving into the compound there, and there's all this construction going on, and he says, what's that? And I said, it's the Polynesian Cultural Center. He erupted. And the next day in the state conference, he erupted. He was furious that this had gone on after the 12 had voted it down. Now, you fast forward a few years, and Mike gets a call one day from Art Haycock, who is the secretary to the church president, Harold B. Lee. He said, Mike, you're going to be in Salt Lake soon. Yeah, Lorraine's got a gig up there. We'll be up there. All right, the president wants to see you. Come in. So he went in, and he said, I sat down, and President Lee says, I'm here to apologize to you. Sitting president of the church. He said, I was not in complete command of the facts when I blew up in Hawaii. And Mike walked out of the room and turned to Art and said, what's that all about? And he said, I've been here a long time. He says, when they move from that chair to that one, they change. And that was a real eye-opener to me that, yeah, we can get very critical, and I have dished out enough criticism along the way as well. But you're not seeing the whole picture. You might do it differently in that setting, and I might do it differently. But I'm willing to cut them some slack because of everything that I've seen and read and experienced now. Lee did a similar thing later on. Bob Bennett, the deceased Utah senator, was a very good friend. And he called me up after the McKay book came out and said, I just want to tell you how much I've enjoyed reading that. And he said, let me tell you a story. He said, I was in a hotel lobby years ago, and Harold B. Lee was there. And he said, it was just the two of us. So we started to chat, and he said, Bob's, how's your brother doing? Well, he said, my brother had left the church. And I said, he's left the church. Well, why did he do that? He said, he got too close to power, saw how it was going. And he said, Lee just shook his head and he says, oh, doesn't he understand? We're just human beings doing the best we can. But we don't cut him that slack. It's much easier to generalize and then to go shrieking through the corridors. And a lot of people do that. And I can understand that because I've seen a lot of what goes on, and I'm not defending everything that goes on because a lot of it is bad stuff and should be fixed. But I think it's got a better chance of being fixed if some of the brighter minds could stay in and produce the information that helps them to fix it without them understanding that that's what you're doing. That's the key.
So you have to help them without them knowing you're trying to help them.
Yeah, Paul Dunn said that President McKay called him in one time. He says, you're going to speak in General Conference in the priesthood session. He said, I want you to scold the fathers, but don't tell them that's what you're doing.
So because you got to go, we got to end on this. We've got at least 2 or 3 hours more with Greg Prince. He's promised us. So I'm going to hold you to it in the next week or two. In the meantime, we'll get you out on this. There's 3 groups I want you to give a parting message to. Orthodox believers that are still in, what's your parting message to them? Struggling members who are questioning and doubting and considering leaving, what's your message to them? And people who have left, who no longer believe, who are done with it.
Okay.
What's your message to them?
Yeah, to the Orthodox, I would say that I hope one of 2 things for you. Either that you can continue to reside in a space that works for you, which means you're going to have to shut a lot of things out. But a lot of people do that, and they're successful at that for the rest of their lives. If that's working for them, I'm okay with that, because ultimately it has to work for them to be good for them. Or that you'll be able to move safely if you can't buffer out all of these external data points. So that's my message to the Orthodox. To make that movement is going to be difficult, but to stay here and insulate oneself from everything that's out there is going to be really difficult too. And it's made multiples more difficult because of the internet. You can't escape it. You don't have to go looking for it. It'll find you. To the ones who are struggling, I would say, do a self-assessment and figure out, why am I in this thing to begin with? Is it because I believe in this list of propositions up on the wall, or is there something deeper? If it's this, then you got a problem, and you better start to try to fix it. You can get into this intellectually. That's what Leonard did. That was his whole approach to it. But it's not the only pathway to get there. And so they've got to assess both sides of their spiritual life and figure out what's faith, what's belief, what needs to get fixed if I'm going to be able to stay in here. To the ones who have left, I would wish them well and offer them continued friendship and hope that they can make it work for them wherever they reside. I don't think that many, if any of those, are likely to come back in. I don't see that happening. I think that once they leave, they're gone. I'd like it to be otherwise. We don't have a good track record in this church of bringing people back in once they bailed.
What about Maxine? Don Bradley.
Out of how many? Yeah.
So it's
out
just
of how
rare.
many?
So
It can happen, but that's not what you're going to put your money. So those are the 3 that you've asked me to speak to, and I've spoken to them.
Well, Greg Prince, thank you so much for giving us good 4 hours on Mormon Stories. This isn't his 2nd appearance. He reminds me it's his 4th appearance, possibly.
I think so.
Please join us at mormonstories.org to comment, to give constructive feedback or questions. Those of you who support us financially, please know that that's what makes this possible. If you don't support us, please consider signing up for a monthly donation at one of our websites, including mormonstories.org. It's all tax deductible. And know that in a few weeks we'll be releasing an in-depth look at Leonard Arrington and Greg Prince's beautiful biography on this man who was church historian for 10 years. Thank you, Greg, for your words of wisdom.
You're welcome,
and for
John.
your contributions to Mormonism.
No audience applause?